what's essentially happening in the north of the Gaza Strip right now is what residents there are describing as the most intense period of the war since the very beginning. So there are three cities in northern Gaza, Jabalia, Beit Hanun and Beit Lahia, which since a little more than a month ago, the Israeli army has been intensely bombarding and besieging and basically forcing residents to flee at gunpoint. Now, there was a really interesting comment from an Israeli commander that was given in a kind of closed briefing to Israeli media earlier this week, in which he said that almost that entire area has been evacuated of its population and there will be no return of civilians and that no humanitarian aid is reaching those areas because there's no civilians left. Wow. Now, we know there are civilians there. There are several thousand left and likely more than the Israeli army is telling us. The army distanced itself from those comments pretty quickly, I think, obviously, because they amount to clear war crimes, you know, the crime of forced transfer, the crime of starvation as a weapon of war. But really what we're seeing in the north and what we're hearing from Palestinians there is that exactly is what's playing out there.
Could you give my listeners an idea of what it looks like at the moment in northern Gaza? Because, of course, getting Western journalists and their cameras into that space has been rendered almost impossible by the Israeli administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just that there's no foreign journalists there. There are almost no Palestinian journalists left there because so many of the population have been forced out in recent weeks. But what we do know and what we are receiving kind of footage of is just horrendous airstrikes. You know, there are 3 hospitals in the besieged areas that are trying their best to handle the cases that are coming in, but they're just, you know, totally under-resourced. And, you know, it's just more and more people every day are coming in with the most horrendous injuries. And, you know, I think the fact that this is happening almost in the absence of media attention is really dangerous and really worrying.
I suppose to marry together those two threads, that there's very, very, very little to return to. But,
Indeed.
But if it is policy, and I take your point that the IDF has sought to distance itself from its own general, if it is policy to render it unreturnable to, then is it hyperbole to hear the word annexation on the horizon?
Not at all. And I think there was another really interesting statement from an Israeli leader this week was given by Israel's outgoing defense minister, Yoav Gallant, in a meeting yesterday with the families of Israeli hostages. Yes. Gallant was fired by Netanyahu earlier this week. So yesterday was kind of his last day in the job. He was fired after long-standing and very kind of well-publicized disagreements. And what Gallant said to the families of Israeli hostages is that really their objectives have been achieved in Gaza, the military objectives at least. And this, you know, Gallant is no dove. He was one of the kind of iron fist generals leading the charge at the beginning of the war. And he said the objectives have been achieved. There's nothing left for us in Gaza anymore. So really what that leaves us with is the fact that Netanyahu is prolonging the war for his own personal and political gain. And what that means on the political level is keeping the far right in his coalition by means very likely of moving towards annexing the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And what comes next, as everyone knows, is Jewish settlements in the Strip.
I think you've preempted part of my next question, which harks back to the early days of this episode, when, if we turned our attention to these issues or to Israeli actions in Gaza as a phone-in, people would queue up to tell me that everything being done, sadly, was justified by those twin objectives of releasing hostages or eradicating Hamas. Is there any way in which more recent events in northern Gaza could be filed under either of those headlines?
Well, I think Gallant tells us a lot from his statements, but what we also heard from some commanders who spoke to Israel's Haaretz newspaper earlier last month is that, as far as they're concerned, there was no military reason for starting this major operation in the north of the Gaza Strip. You know, they said that the main objective seemed to be clearing the civilian population. And I think it's very obvious, like, there's no military justification for what's going on. Yes, the army is still fighting with kind of small numbers of Hamas fighters in certain areas, including in these areas. Yes. But what we're seeing is not just the kind of what it essentially amounts to ethnic cleansing of the population, but also the army is destroying and burning shelters and homes that the population has been cleared out of, leaving just nothing for them to go back to, as you said.
On a slightly different note, Ben, have there been any developments on that other big story this week, alongside the dismissal of Yoav Gallant, the espionage allegations at the very heart of Benjamin Netanyahu's administration?
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot that seems to be kind of circling in on Netanyahu right now. So this is a story whereby what we know so far, and we don't know so much because there's an Israeli court gag order kind of preventing the publication of certain details, but we know that several people close to Netanyahu have been arrested on suspicion of making manipulative use of classified intelligence information, some of which was publicized by the Jewish Chronicle in this country and Bild in Germany. We know that what was published was either entirely fake or manipulated. And it seems from this investigation, which is being overseen by the Israeli police, the Israeli Shin Bet, which is the internal security agency, and the Israeli army itself, is that these documents were taken out of kind of classified places and sent around to foreign media in an attempt, it seems, to influence the Israeli public towards Netanyahu's position on kind of deferring hostage negotiations and preventing basically a ceasefire.
As you say, there is a sense of a circling, but of course Netanyahu has been circled before many times. So what do we think might happen next?
Well, I think this kind of the revealing classified information story is going to be, it's a massive scandal, and this is going to be headline news in Israel for weeks and months to come. I think what comes next, as you said, Netanyahu is no stranger to kind of legal cases. He's been on trial for various corruption allegations since 2020. This is a guy who is the master of kind of dismissing and deferring. What he's also doing is seemingly kind of eliminating any voices of dissent from around his close circle. So we saw that with Gallant. There were also reports this week that he's potentially, and Netanyahu's denied this, but reports that he's potentially considering also firing the head of the army, the head of the Shin Bet, and the Attorney General. So, this is a man who doesn't like dissent. This is a man who wants to get his own way. And I think in Gaza, that's what we're seeing.